Tales of the first English settlers disappearing from Roanoke Island have been shared for nearly a century, but now...
Over 400 years ago, England sent a group of 117 people to a small island off the coast of North America, hoping to establish its first permanent foothold in the New World. But soon after the settlement began, the colony was cut off from England. For 3 long years, supply ships never arrived, and no one knew what had happened to the people left behind. When help finally came, the colony had vanished. Homes stood empty, fires were cold, and there were no bodies, no signs of battle, no clues to explain their disappearance. For centuries, the fate of Roanoke remained a mystery. It wasn't until researchers began examining the evidence closely that they found out what had actually happened to those settlers. But before we get to that, you need to understand how the colony began in the first place. England's colonial gamble, Roanoke Island, sits off the coast of what is now North Carolina, between the mainland and the open Atlantic Ocean. In the late 1500s, this narrow stretch of land caught England's attention for one simple reason: location. Ships traveling along the Atlantic coast could reach it easily, and from there move inland along rivers that promised access to trade routes and resources. At the time, England was falling behind other European powers. Spain had already established strong colonies in the Caribbean and Central America. England needed its own foothold in the New World, not just to compete economically, but to challenge Spanish control of the Atlantic. Roanoke offered that opportunity. It could serve as a supply station for English ships, a base for exploration, and a starting point for expanding inland. But Roanoke also came with serious risks. The land was unfamiliar. The climate was unpredictable. So, as you can expect, from the beginning, England struggled to get a foothold in it. In 1585, the first English expedition arrived under Sir Richard Grenville, with Ralph Lane appointed as governor. The journey itself set the tone for what followed. Storms scattered the fleet, and the flagship ran aground, destroying valuable supplies before the settlers had even begun building. Soon after, food supplies got low, and morale weakened. With no other option, the settlers turned to nearby indigenous tribes for survival. At first, the plan worked. The English traded tools and metal goods for food, creating a fragile balance that kept the colony alive. Over time, however, that balance began to break down. Lane grew suspicious and increasingly aggressive toward the surrounding tribes. His actions strained relationships that were already fragile. When he ordered a preemptive attack on a local leader, trust collapsed completely. In response, the tribes cut off food supplies. By mid-1586, the colony was unraveling. Starvation became a real and immediate threat, and the relief ships the settlers depended on failed to arrive. Once again, they faced a familiar choice: stay and risk death, or leave and survive. Sir Francis Drake unexpectedly arrived during his voyage. He offered to take the settlers with him, and they accepted without hesitation. They left Roanoke not because they wanted to, but because abandoning the colony had become the safest option. Weeks later, another English expedition led by Grenville returned to find the settlement empty. There was no message and no explanation. Instead of rebuilding, he left behind 15 men to maintain England's claim to the land. The decision proved ineffective. When the English returned, those men were gone too, leaving behind only rumors and a single skeleton. By the time John White led a new group of settlers in 1587, Roanoke was no longer a fresh opportunity. It was a place shaped by repeated failure. The land had already shown that colonies could disappear quietly, without violence or panic. But this time, the settlers planned to stay and finally establish a lasting foothold. 3 silent years. When John White left Roanoke Island in late August of 1587, the plan was simple: sail to England, gather supplies, and return within a year. The settlers believed help was coming. They had no reason to think otherwise. But what they thought would be a short supply trip turned into a disappearance, one that would stretch not for months, but for years. So how did everything go so wrong? Once John White reached England, the world around him began to change fast. By 1588, England was preparing for war. Spain was assembling a massive fleet, and the threat of invasion loomed over the entire country. The Atlantic Ocean became dangerous overnight. Queen Elizabeth I ordered that all ships remain in English ports, ready to defend the nation. All civilian voyages were cancelled, and colonial resupply missions were suspended. So Roanoke was suddenly cut off. White tried to return anyway. He joined 2 small ships headed toward the colony, but the journey never made it across the ocean. French privateers attacked the ships. They were badly damaged, and White himself was injured. With England locked in war, crossing the Atlantic was nearly impossible. Every year that passed brought more danger, more delays, and fewer opportunities. White continued searching for passage, but the war always came first. Meanwhile, on Roanoke Island, things weren't looking good. No supplies arrived. There were no ships on the horizon, and worst of all, they got no explanation of what had gone wrong. But here's the thing. Colonists were used to delays. They understood that help could take longer than promised, especially during wartime. Weeks could turn into months, months into years. During those 3 years, no reports came back to England describing an attack. No warnings, no confirmed sightings of violence, no evidence of sudden destruction. All that existed was a communication gap. And because no information arrived in England, some people believed something terrible had happened and that the colony might have been lost. However, in 1590, John White finally secured passage back to Roanoke. But now, 3 years had passed, far longer than anyone intended. So when White returned at last, he believed the colony might have found a way to survive on its own. Instead, what he found was far more unsettling. The strange carvings. When John White returned to Roanoke Island in 1590, he was braced for tragedy. So as soon as his ships approached the shore, something felt wrong. There were no signal fires, no boats in the water, no movement along the coastline. Already worried, White began searching the island, and what he found next would become one of the most debated moments in early American history. The settlement was gone. The houses he had helped build were no longer standing. But this wasn't destruction. The wooden structures hadn't been burned or smashed. They had been carefully taken apart. Also, there were no scattered belongings, no broken tools, no human remains. So, if this were an attack, where was the chaos? But as White examined whatever lay behind, he found something that shocked him even more. Carved into a wooden post near the middle of the old settlement was a single word, Croatan. Nearby, cut into the trunk of a tree, were 3 letters, CRO. But what were these messages, and why carve them into tree trunks? One thing was clear. The markings were deliberate, and they were still clear, suggesting they hadn't been exposed to the elements for very long. This wasn't graffiti. It was a message, and it was one White immediately understood. Croatan referred to Croatan Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, home to the Croatan people, a native group that had previously maintained friendly relations with the English settlers. But why would anyone carve that name in here? The shorter carving, CRO, appears to be an unfinished version of the same word, possibly left by someone who was interrupted or forced to stop before finishing. But here's the detail that changes everything. Before White left in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a system. If the colony ever had to abandon Roanoke under danger or attack, they would carve a message and mark it with a cross. White looked carefully. There was no cross, and that absence was crucial. Because without it, the message didn't signal panic. It didn't suggest violence or fear. Instead, it pointed to something else entirely, a planned departure. The settlement also pointed toward that idea. Supplies weren't scattered. Defensive structures remained intact. Nothing suggested a rushed escape. The colonists appeared to have left with time, intention, and order. But why would they leave at all? White believed the word was meant specifically for him. It was a known location, a place he could follow. In his own writings, he recorded that he understood Croatan as a destination. But questions remained. Why leave only one word? Why leave Roanoke at all? And if they moved somewhere else, why didn't they leave more signs behind? White wanted answers. He was prepared to sail to Croatan Island and continue the search. But once again, fate intervened. The island was hit by a storm. One ship lost its anchor. Another nearly ran aground. The crews feared becoming trapped by worsening weather and refused to stay longer. White had no choice. He was forced to leave, without following the only lead the colonists had left behind. And so the carved word remained. For hundreds of years, people have called it a mystery. But when you notice what's missing, no violence, no fear, it starts to feel less like a final clue and more like a quiet message, left by people who trusted someone would come looking. Which leads to the question that still haunts historians today. If the colonists left on their own terms, where did they go next? And what happened after they arrived? Theories and explanations. Once the empty settlement and the carved word were discovered, various theories were proposed to explain what might have happened. Almost immediately, one idea dominated the conversation. The Roanoke colonists must have met a violent end: disease, starvation, attack by foreign forces. These became the most common answers. But do they actually fit the evidence? Let's look closer. One theory suggests the colonists might have been killed by local Native American tribes. Conflict had existed before, and tensions were real. But when John White returned in 1590, he found no signs of violence. No bodies, no graves, no burned buildings. Instead, what he saw was careful dismantling, order, and planning. So, if a violent attack had occurred, why would there be no signs of it? Another explanation points to disease or starvation. Life on Roanoke was harsh, sickness was common, and food shortages had already forced settlers to abandon the island once before. Could that account for the colony's disappearance? Perhaps. But consider this. Even disease and famine leave traces. Roanoke had none of that. Some even suggested that Spanish forces had destroyed the colony. England and Spain were at war while White was away, and Spanish ships patrolled parts of the American coast. But historical records show that Spanish explorers continued to search for the colony years later. They had no idea what happened, and elsewhere, when the Spanish did attack, their destruction was unmistakable. But on Roanoke, none of those signs existed. Over the centuries, the story became stranger. People thought it might be supernatural forces, curses, and mythical creatures that had taken the colony. But these explanations, as entertaining as they are, rely on imagination, not evidence. They ignore the practical details left behind: the careful dismantling, the clear message carved into wood, the absence of destruction. When we compare all the sudden death theories to what John White actually saw on Roanoke Island, a clear pattern emerges. Violence, disease, attack, all leave marks. Roanoke left none. Which brings us to a quieter, more plausible possibility. The colonists did not vanish. They moved. Faced with isolation, dwindling supplies, and no rescue in sight, they made a choice. They sought safety. They sought survival. They left on their own terms, perhaps joining people they already knew. So here's the question we should be asking. Not how the settlers died, but how they lived after leaving Roanoke. What really happened? For centuries, the story of Roanoke depended entirely on words on paper and endless guesses, but everything changed when the ground itself began to speak. One of the first major clues came from a centuries-old map. In the late 1500s, John White, with the help of Thomas Harriot, had drawn a detailed map called La Virginia Pars. For generations, it appeared ordinary, but in 2012, something extraordinary was discovered. Researchers at the British Museum used advanced imaging techniques to examine the map. Beneath a small patch, they found a tiny star-shaped mark. At the time, stars on maps often indicated forts, and this one, it was far inland, near where the Chowan and Roanoke rivers meet. That location became known as Site X. Starting in 2007, archaeologists from the First Colony Foundation began digging, and what they found changed the narrative entirely. Pieces of English pottery from the late 1500s appeared alongside Native American artifacts. It was not a battlefield, not a site of abandonment, but a place where English settlers and indigenous people were living together, not fighting, not just passing through. Then there was Hatteras Island, once called Croatan Island, the very place White had seen carved in the message left at Roanoke. Archaeologists uncovered European tools and weapons there, evidence of clear contact between the colonists and the Croatan people. But there was one thing that discovery stood out above all: the hammer scale. Hammer scale forms when red-hot iron is struck, sending tiny flakes flying. Native metalworking in the region did not produce hammer scale. Its presence proved that English blacksmiths were working on the island, not just trading finished goods. This wasn't a brief stopover, it was long-term living. At another site near modern-day Manteo, in what is now the Elizabethan Gardens, archaeologists found native pottery alongside a piece of copper wire. Historian Eric Klingelhofer pointed out that the wire was made using European techniques, not indigenous ones, further evidence that English settlers were living alongside native communities. So what does all of this mean? When looked at together, the artifacts tell a clear story. The Roanoke colonists did not disappear suddenly. They left the island, and they survived. Some likely joined native tribes, adapting to a new way of life. The ground shows no signs of violence or catastrophe. Instead, it shows everyday life continuing, metalworking, shared spaces, and tools in use over the years. The people of Roanoke were not lost. They simply lived on, beyond the place where history had stopped watching. For a long time, the Roanoke colony has been remembered as a place where people disappeared without explanation. But when the story is put together carefully, the mystery becomes much simpler. The settlers did not vanish suddenly. They faced hard conditions, waited for help that never came, and made choices to survive. Instead of staying in one unsafe place, they moved toward a place that offered the best chance to endure. So, what do you think really happened to the Roanoke settlers? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. If you liked this video, ensure you give it a thumbs up. Also, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, because we will be uploading more crazy stories like this one in the coming weeks. Until then, see ya!